Welcome to Another Business Blaze. I am your host, Simon Whistler. As always, today's one, you already know from the title, unless this autoplayed. In that case, I guess you don't. Michael Jackson bought the Beatles, not into slavery or something, but he bought all of their songs. And I kind of thought this was just a legend. I had Danny put together a script all about this. It's even more wild than you could possibly think. I did a little bit of digging into it before we got started. It's absurd. So let's jump into it. Let's just get one thing out of the way. The Beatles were the greatest band of all time, and anyone who disagrees is an idiot. Listen, Danny, I like the Beatles. I like the Beatles as much as anyone. Greatest band of all time, though. Let me tell you a little bit about a band called Five. I have a few friends who claim they don't like the Beatles, but the annoying thing is how many times they feel the need to publicly announce that they don't like the Beatles, as if this is something that makes them more interesting than everybody else. It's true. It's oh yeah, I don't like the Beatles. Oh, you're so edgy. Also, who the doesn't like the Beatles? Or who doesn't like the biggest of the Beatles songs? Because they're just objectively great. I'm not gonna dive into every song on their catalog and be like, this is amazing, because there's some pretty bad songs, as we'll probably learn about. I'm convinced that some of these people are destined to be buried under gravestones with epitaphs that read something along the lines of, "Here lies John Doe. He didn't like the Beatles, he never had a Facebook account, and he never watched a single episode of Game of Thrones." That's not true about me. I saw the first episode of Game of Thrones twice. I didn't like it either times, but I don't like fantasy, which is weird, because I love science fiction. I'm a big old Star Trek nerd, but Star Wars, Game of Thrones, all of that stuff, I just can't get into it. I saw the first Lord of the Rings movie. Sucked. Smash that dislike button. Well, people on my podcast also tell me that it's unusual that I've never seen The Princess Bride. So now we've established the unquestionable genius and brilliance. If you want to subscribe to my podcast, that's Brain Food Show. Brain Food, one word, wherever you get your podcasts. So now we've established the unquestionable genius and brilliance of the band that gave us such classics as Yellow Submarine, Obla Di, Obla Da. Why don't we do it in the road? Wait, is that a joke? I've never heard of that Beatles song. Is that really a Beatles? Okay, it is a Beatles song. Guessing it's from the White Album with that album cover. Right there. Why don't we do it? Okay, I'd never heard of that one, but whatever. Anyway, let's fast forward to a moment in 1989, not long after the split of the band and the death of John Lennon. Paul McCartney was playing an epic solo world tour, and he was naturally keen to play some of the 227 songs that he'd co-written with Lennon back in the days when the Fab Four pretty much ruled the airwaves. It is absolutely insane. You would think that the Beatles were around for decades, considering how much stuff they wrote. It's extraordinary. You can't blame them either. The audience were going to be paying a small fortune for their tickets, and they certainly didn't want the whole set to be geared around the rubbish that he did with Linda, or that god-awful thing he made with a frog chorus. I don't know that, but Danny, look. Everyone knows that the worst music associated with the Beatles, although not directly, is this by Yoko Ono. This, I'm just going to skip to the middle, and we'll only listen to a few seconds because there's absolutely no way I want Yoko Ono to get any of the money from this video. Listen to this absolute piece of shit. It just goes on like that for 3 minutes and 5 seconds. He also quite fancied the idea of printing the lyrics to some of the Beatles classics that he had been performing within the tour program. However, he changed his mind when he realized that he'd have to pay a substantial royalty to Michael Jackson for printing out his own lyrics. In fact, Jackson would also receive royalties every time Paul McCartney played one of the songs that he'd co-written with Lennon all of those years ago, because the self-named King of Pop, Michael Jackson, owns the publishing rights to the entire back catalogue of the Beatles. Isn't this one of those facts that you read and you're like, nah, that's just like a legend. Like the Coca-Cola and cocaine, the cocaine and Coca-Cola thing, which is also true. This is also true. So how did Paul McCartney manage to lose control of his own vast archive of classics? And is it true to say that he was royally shafted by his former friend, or can the real culprit be found loitering somewhere on Broad Street? The story begins in 1963 when the Beatles were still just on the brink of world domination. Their manager at the time, Brian Epstein, was seeking a music publishing deal for the band, and he teamed up with music mogul Dick James. The end result was the launch of a new company called Northern Songs, which would hold what an original name, which would hold all of the publishing rights to the Beatles' compositions. As Dick James was the one pumping the money in, as well as expertise and clout, he became the majority shareholder of Northern Song, Lennon and McCartney getting a 20% stake each. Yeah, he was pumping money, expertise, and clout in, but it's not his music. Whatever this guy is, what he is really is a great businessman. A couple of years later, in 1965, Northern Songs became a public company. Dick James still retained a big stake in the business, while Lennon and McCartney were each given just 15%. At this point, it's worth remembering, where are the other Beatles? It wasn't just two of them. At this point, it's worth remembering that there are two other Beatles in the band who often contributed tracks, although not, of course, on the same scale or with the same levels of success as Lennon and McCartney. George Harrison and Ringo Starr were pretty much left the crumbs of the deal, splitting only a tiny percentage of the company. This has got to royally suck. George Harrison was so disgruntled about this that he wrote the Beatles track Only a Northern Song to vent his vexation about his small cut. It wasn't very good, and nobody cared. Oh, poor George. Poor George. By the time we get to 1969, the Beatles was almost over. Lennon and McCartney were beginning to realize that despite writing a whole stack of some of the most acclaimed and successful songs in history, they were getting screwed over by a very bad deal. To be fair, guys, it was a really bad deal that you made. Although maybe, okay, so there's a couple of ways to look at this. It's a really bad deal that they made, so maybe they shouldn't have made the deal. But also, if they didn't make the deal, would they really have been big? Because, it seems like there's clout and energy and stuff. It took the Beatles pretty far. Is 15% of something worth more than 50% of nothing? They started legal proceedings against Northern Songs to try and recoup some of their royalties that they felt they were owed, at which point Dick James threw his toys out of the pram and sold his 35% stake of the company to Lou Grade from ATV Music without telling John or Paul. I wouldn't say that's throwing the toys out of the pram. He's entitled to do that. It's a public company. You can sell whatever he wants. And also, legal proceedings against him. For what? You made a bad business deal. Although this stake was big, it was no longer a majority stake, so Lennon and McCartney still had an opportunity to buy out all the other shareholders and wrestle control of the company from Lou Grade. But the relationship between the band members, it was beginning to break down, and after months of disagreements, threats, financial problems, and internal fightings, Lennon and McCartney just gave up on the whole idea and cashed in all their shares to ATV, making Lou Grade the majority shareholder of the Beatles' back catalogue, and leaving the songwriters with no ownership at all. At this time, an exasperated Lennon lamented, "I'm sick of being f***ed about by men in suits sitting on their fat asses in the city." It is pretty incredible that just over a period of a few years, all of the stuff they wrote no longer belongs to them. So if they want to perform the songs, they have to start. I think they could even not be allowed to perform their own songs because they just don't own them. It would be like me performing a Beatles song on here. It's like, I'm not going to get to keep that money. ATV retained control of the Beatles' back catalogue for 16 years before putting it up for sale in the 1980s. By this time, of course, the band had long since split up. John Lennon had died, Paul McCartney had formed and disbanded Wings, George Harrison had made a few albums, and Ringo Starr had become the voice of Thomas the Tank Engine? Really? Wow, okay, so Thomas the Tank Engine, when I was growing up, was narrated by Ringo Starr, and I had no idea. Is that something commonly known? Also, I'm not sure I feel about that as Ringo Starr. You're like literally a pop god, and then you're the voice of Thomas the Tank Engine. It'd be like, I'm Ringo Starr! McCartney had struck up a friendship with Michael Jackson, who was seeking business advice from Paul during the video shoot for their 1983 duet Say Say Say. Judging by this whole article so far, Paul McCartney is not the man I would go to for business advice. Paul recommended that Jackson should get into the lucrative business of buying the publishing rights to classic artists, something that Paul himself had recently dabbled in, as it just snapped up the rights to the back catalogue of Buddy Holly. What the Paul? You're like, this is so wrong, he's taken all my rights. Oh, it was Lennon who said the thing about the, men in the city stealing his rights. And then Paul's like, if you can't beat him, join him. You'd also have this bizarre situation that Paul McCartney could perform, Buddy Holly songs, but he couldn't perform his own music, like Peggy Sue. Michael commented that he'd love to buy the Beatles songs, but Paul assumed he was just joking. It turns out he wasn't. A little while later, when ATV decided to sell off its entire music division, including the Beatles' back catalogue, McCartney hooked up with the estate of John Lennon, primarily his widow, Yoko Ono, to make a bid in the region of $15 million for the catalogue. We'll come back to that in more detail in a moment, but the bid was ultimately rejected in favor of a $47.5 million bid from Michael Jackson in 1986. That's gotta suck when, like, you're Paul McCartney, like the Beatles Paul McCartney, and Michael Jackson is just infinitely richer than you, that you make a bid of $15 million and he offers like 3 times that for your own music. And $15 million is what you got with a share of John Lennon as well. That's devastating. You know what else would be devastating is Paul McCartney having to talk to Yoko Ono. Jesus. The King of Pop was now the owner of around 250 classic Lennon-McCartney compositions, and he would hold a stake of them until his death in 2009. Just to clarify, this doesn't mean that Jackson raked in 100% of the royalties from all the use of the Beatles songs. Paul McCartney and the estate of John Lennon still shared between them 33% of the songwriting royalties in the US and around 50% in other countries, with the rest largely going in Jackson's pocket. Wait, how does that work? Didn't they sell all their rights? This right stuff is really confusing. I can't actually figure it out. I'm just gonna trust Danny on this one. If anyone knows how that works, I would love to know in the comments. But it's fair to say that McCartney was far from happy about the way things had panned out with his former buddy. Paul, you're a bit of a hypocrite, aren't you? Paul originally hoped that Michael Jackson might be planning to do the right thing and at least increase the royalty share awarded to McCartney and the estate of Lennon. Why would he do that? Can you imagine, like, he just spent $47.5 million on it in 1986. So that is way more money today. Maybe 100 mil, I don't know, just guessing. And then Paul's like, hey Mike, do you mind giving me just a little bit more money for all of the songs that you bought? What's he gonna be like, super charitable? Yeah, sure, John. I didn't just spend, $50 million on that. But when McCartney tried suggesting that maybe it was time he got a long overdue pay rise, long overdue? What are you talking about, Danny? He paid $50 million for it. From his own songs, Jackson wasn't very responsive and the friendship fizzled out. What a surprise. McCartney was also annoyed by the way that Jackson commercialized the Beatles' back catalogue by licensing out songs for television adverts. The Beatles had always been very protective of their work. Except they sold it all. And McCartney felt that Jackson was diluting the magic by pimping out the Beatles' classics to the likes of Nike to help them flog their latest trainers in exchange for wads of cash. In fact, it's estimated that Jackson made around $1 billion from his purchase of the ATV music division, which isn't too shabby from a $47.5 million investment. Michael Jackson, you weirdo, but you absolute business legend. So was Michael Jackson the villain here? Is it bad being like, these guys, they made their own bed? And also, Paul McCartney, I'd feel a bit more sympathy if Paul McCartney wasn't like, I'll buy Buddy Holly and whatever else he bought. It's really lucrative, Mike. And then Mike does it, and he's like, Mike, what the hell? We don't know how close the friendship ever really was between McCartney and Jackson, but it certainly was an odd thing to do to a friend. Jackson must have known that Paul was interested in buying back his own songs, and it's possible that the songs would have ended up back in their rightful place if Jackson hadn't intervened. Michael Jackson himself had very little to say on the subject other than it's just business. But the real problem here was the long list of missed opportunities by the Beatles themselves. Back in 1963, they signed a crap deal with Dick James to form Northern Songs. There's no great shame in this. Plenty of budding artists are signed on the dotted line for crap deals with people who claimed they were going to make them rich. To be fair, he did make them rich. Would they necessarily be where they were without him? I mean, yes, he kind of took tons of their money and stuff, but you can write great music, but you might not be successful. There are loads of artists out there who write incredible stuff, but are just not super popular. But in 1969, when Dick James sold his shares to Lou Grade, they completely messed up a real opportunity to claw back a controlling stake in their own back catalogue. During this period, it was revealed that McCartney had been secretly buying up extra shares in the company without telling Lennon. The tension between the two band members, the Beatles' manager, and their lawyers meant they couldn't agree on the best way of going about the deal, and so in the end they all just threw in the towel and cashed in their songs to ATV. It sounds like Paul McCartney really wants to be a shrewd businessman, but he isn't. And then whenever he gets screwed, he's like, that's not fair. However, another big culprit later down the line is Paul McCartney's 1984 film, Give My Regards to Broad Street. Things got very complicated when ATV were ready to sell off their music division in the 1980s. They hoped to sell off their entire catalogue of thousands of songs in one bumper package, including the Beatles stuff. McCartney and Yoko Ono were trying to persuade ATV to split up the package so they could just purchase the Beatles stuff at a cheaper price. The process of negotiation got very long-winded, and it could have been avoided altogether if McCartney had just a bit more money at the time to throw at the deal and seal it. This would have been a good move. It may seem strange now to think of Paul McCartney ever being a bit strapped for cash, but he was in a much weaker financial position after the complete flop of that previously mentioned movie. Paul had put down $1 million of his own company's money as security against a $9 million loan to help finance the film. When the film turned out to be a box office disaster, his company had to pay back the $9 million. If McCartney and Yoko only had a few more million between them at the time to offer ATV, it's likely they would have secured the deal. But while their bids and counterbids and requests to split up the music division rumbled on, Michael Jackson swooped in with a $47.5 million bid to buy the whole of ATV's music division outright. And he probably paid in cash. He did, because he was unbelievably rich. So, who owns the Beatles' back catalogue now? After Jackson's death in 2009, Sony acquired the ATV music catalogue. However, the US Copyright Act of 1976 states that the ownership of any copyrighted works released before 1978 revert back to the original songwriters after a period of 56 years. And yes, we've just about hit that period where the Beatles started releasing their first hit singles back in 1963. So in theory at least, by the year 2026, an 84-year-old Paul McCartney should have reclaimed his share of the entire Beatles output before the band split in 1970. Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit against Sony in 2017, which signaled his intention to reclaim his ownership of his share of the Beatles' back catalogue. He didn't have an ownership! Reclaim what? He sold it! A confidential settlement agreement was reached between the two parties, so we may never know the full details and figures. I hope it was just an envelope from Sony that just said F off. But it seems likely that Paul McCartney has finally got a fair cut of the millions of dollars that have been generated from the songs he wrote for nothing over half a century ago. He wrote for nothing, except now he's mad famous and successful and rich. It just sounds like he made a bad business deal that wasn't even that bad of a business deal that just turned out wrong. Maybe I'm being way too harsh on Paul McCartney here, but I have a different opinion to Danny on this one. Anyway, this has been Business Plays. This was a wild ride of a story. This is one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites on this channel is Fordlandia, where Henry Ford basically just builds an American suburb in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. If you like this one, I really like that one as well. I imagine you'll probably like it. I will link to it below. Also, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, smash that like button, unless you like Yoko Ono's music, in which case, smash that dislike button because I don't like you. Anyway, I'll see you next time.